Imagine a world of beautiful waifus, both beastly and human. But hey, surely they get sick too, right? Well, this is where our protagonist comes in, a doctor who runs a clinic with a half-snake waifu. In this clinic, he treats all kinds of patients, especially waifus. Yes, waifus, as you heard. Despite being part monster, the protagonist treats them all equally. But the small detail is that while doing his job, he must deal with the jealousy of his Medusa companion. Yes, folks, the doc has her completely smitten, but it doesn't end there. As they continue working, they'll meet more waifus who'll leave the protagonist, let's say, very distracted. Will he manage to control himself, or will he unleash his fury and form a harem? Well, stay tuned, and I'll tell you the story of Glenn. Before we start, don't forget to support me with like and subscribe, also share, and thank you. Glenn Litbite, a rookie doctor, starts working at a clinic with his assistant, Saphantite Neeks, who we'll just call Medusa from now on. This waifu makes it clear from the start that she has feelings for the protagonist because, while he was examining a patient, she gave him a jealous look. But who could blame her? The guy was inspecting the front area of a minotaur as if he were searching for treasure. Thankfully, he didn't find anything wrong, even though the patient claimed she was in pain. He checked her ears and realized she was pregnant. With everything in order, they called her husband to share the good news, and the lovebirds left feeling relieved. At that moment, the protagonist receives a letter from his mentor, Dr. Thulhi, asking him to visit the Colosseum to care for her patients while she's out of town. This news excited the protagonist since he was still learning from his octopus mentor and loved helping people who needed his services. However, Medusa wasn't thrilled, not because she was bad, but because she knew most of the protagonist's patients were women, and that made her jealous. When they arrive at the Colosseum, we meet Tizalia, a third-rank fighter representing her family in the Tournament of Battles. Her family is the leader of one of the city's most famous transportation industries. Yes, folks, she's nobility, so she had a bit of an attitude, and everyone respected her for it. Since most of the participants were waifus, the protagonist started examining them. First up was a half-cat waifu who began flirting with him during the consultation. Medusa had to step in to separate her so the protagonist could continue his work. Next was the blonde waifu, who, after a rather intense consultation and several insinuations, was deemed healthy. The protagonist then continued with the other patients. However, just as his day ended, two of his friends, Kai and Lorna, both half-minotaurs, told him they were worried about the blonde waifu. For some strange reason, she hadn't won a single fight in her recent matches, which was hard to believe. Because the waifu was always training hard and was also overpowered, the guy decides to go to the Colosseum to watch the blonde's next match against a half-rabbit waifu. In that fight, Tizalia loses again, but the silver lining in all this is that the protagonist manages to realize what was happening to her. He was sure the exam he had done the day before had gone well. Later, when the waifu is training, he approaches her to explain what was going on. It turns out she didn't have horseshoes on her hooves, which made her legs unbalanced and movement during combat much harder. With the help of her friends, a Medusa and two blacksmiths, the protagonist manages to fit her with horseshoes. The next day, we see that his help paid off, as after losing several fights, she managed to win 4 consecutive matches. Her new Jordans were on fire. After the match, the blonde thanks Glenn for helping her, but poor Glenn couldn't even reply because his partner was watching him closely. In a flashback, we see some of the protagonist's past where he met Medusa. It turns out his family had made a peace pact with the monsters. To ensure they didn't back out of the agreement, they left him with the monsters for a while. It was practically a harem, but the protagonist didn't see it that way. On the contrary, they became friends during that time. However, when the war ended, the waifu had to return to her home. By fate, the two met again at the medical school, and since they already knew each other, they ended up together. Returning to the present, we see the gang heading to the city of Marrow to buy supplies. This city was famous for its aquatic monsters, especially the mermaids. Speaking of them, we see one appear while the lovebirds are strolling around. She comments that they make a cute couple and invites them to her shop. This waifu is Lalala, a cute mermaid who makes a living singing for couples visiting the city. Seeing them together, she offers her services. However, the protagonist gets distracted, staring at her gills, and realizes something is wrong with the lowly. Because of this, Medusa starts a jealousy scene, but Glenn, to calm her down, decides to pay for 2 songs from the waifu. A small misunderstanding occurs because he only pays for 1 song, and the waifu tells him she's not trying to scam him. By the way, the dragon lady who was listening nearby covers the other payment. Fun fact, that dragon waifu is the founder of the city. The protagonist then tells the mermaid he plans to pay for the second song in another way, so the waifu accepts, and right in the middle of the song, the loli starts coughing. That's when it becomes clear her suspicions were correct. She asks the boat driver to take them to a secluded place so she can examine her properly. She checks her mouth and even inserts her fingers into her gills. Don't get the wrong idea, just in case. That's when she realizes the loli has a condition. Since she had been spending so much time out of the water, her gills had become inflamed to the point of affecting her beautiful voice. But no worries, because the protagonist was a total pro at his job and planned to help her. At the same time, we learn that the waifu had a tough life, which is why she spent all her time singing without rest. The conversation gets interrupted by a random child who suddenly appears and falls into the water. Alala quickly dives in to save him. Luckily, the boy, after some CPR, was brought back to life. However, the waifu was left exhausted and fell back into the water without anyone noticing. You might think, she's a mermaid, she can't drown, right? Well, actually, she can because her gills were blocked. Fortunately, the waifu got lucky because Medusa noticed she had fallen into the water, and the protagonist dove in to rescue her. Just before she could join St. Peter, he passed air to her through an underwater kiss. Thanks to that, her gills cleared up. Turns out the protagonist could blow harder than the big bad wolf from the Three Little Pigs. Just kidding. Anyway, Medusa managed to get them out of the water in time, so nothing serious happened. A few days later, we see that Lalala is much better. She even stopped singing at her usual spot and got a new job at a city plaza, where more people could hear her. You could say her life changed for the better, thanks to the protagonist. To spice things up, we see that the Little Mermaid ended up falling in love with the protagonist. And who wouldn't? After such a dramatic kiss, in a scene change, we see a waifu with a Frankenstein-like appearance chasing some guys. However, she didn't expect them to be leading her into a trap where a larger group was waiting for her. Meanwhile, the protagonist and Medusa are at a consultation with a slime waifu, who tries to flirt with Glenn during the session. But since he knew he was being watched, he played dumb and finished the consultation as quickly as possible. Then Mrs. Scotty arrived. This waifu is the dragon lady I mentioned earlier. If you're wondering why someone so important would visit the protagonist's clinic, I'll let her explain. Oh wait, she can't talk. Luckily, she brought her bodyguard. Remember her? Yes, she's the waifu we saw at the beginning of the episode. The reason they came to the clinic was because the waifu was with the bandits the night before, lost an arm, and needed their help. However, the situation was more complicated because they had to find her arm first. On top of that, Katie left and abandoned her with them. The waifu told them she'd better look for her arm on her own since she didn't get along well with doctors. This was because of bad experiences in her past, which made her distrust everyone. While the waifu was walking through the city, she saw one of the bandits from the previous night and decided to follow him into an alley without thinking things through. Because of that, they attacked her and she lost a leg. The commotion scared the people nearby, including Tizalia, who happened to find Kanai's leg. Fortunately, the protagonist was nearby, and the waifu called him to examine it. That's when he realized it was hers. He also noticed the threads stitching her leg were worn out, so he started searching the city to find her and help with her leg. Meanwhile, normal people saw a guy casually carrying a leg in his bag. In the midst of all this, he ran into Lalala, and the waifu handed him Kanai's arm, which she had coincidentally found underwater. But the story doesn't end there. When he cleaned the arm, it was revealed that the waifu could feel everything he was doing to it, even though the arm and leg weren't attached to her body. As this was happening, we saw Kanai crawling through one of the alleys where she had been attacked. She began hearing the voices of the people used to create her, as this waifu was essentially a female version of Frankenstein. Just when she was about to give up, the protagonist found her and helped reattach her parts, even though she didn't want him to. Thanks to this, the voices in her head stopped because he stitched her parts correctly. For some strange reason, while he was operating, she started moaning uncontrollably. It seemed she enjoyed how the protagonist handled the needle. While the protagonist was still helping Kanai, Medusa received a visit from a friend who left her a gift in a basket. She joked about Medusa's relationship with Glenn before leaving. Back to the protagonist. After treating Kanai, the waifu thanked him, and they both returned home. Upon arriving, the protagonist got a big surprise. His companion was pregnant. Wait, how? But the protagonist said it was impossible since lamias are oviparous. He realized she was just trolling him. What she was hiding was the basket her friend had left. which contained a harpy egg. When the protagonist picked it up to examine it, she realized that a group of bandits was approaching the clinic, and if you're wondering how they were spotted, it's because the waifus can see through walls thanks to body heat, something like X-rays. But the waifu wasn't just powerful in that way, she could defend herself too. However, when the bandits broke down the door to enter, she gave one of them a tremendous punch that rebooted his windows. She couldn't do the same to the others, so they had no choice but to escape from the clinic. Once outside, the waifu warned that if anyone dared to touch her, she would send them to meet God. But the protagonist told her to calm down. In the middle of this, kunai appeared and told them that the bandits were slavers who trapped harpies, forcing them to lay eggs to sell them to humans of questionable origin. For that reason, they went after the egg they had. Then, the protagonist asked kunai to help them get protection from the city guards, but most of them were busy with an operation and couldn't assist, so they decided to stay with kunai. The waifu planned to infiltrate the enemy base to free the harpies they had imprisoned, and she wasn't alone. Scotty and Lalala were waiting for her on a boat. They set off together. Here, we learned that the siren had actually been singing in the plaza under Scotty's orders to help locate the bandits. So the waifu was a spy. It seemed she did well on her first mission, but the protagonist was worried about her since she was just a child and was still recovering from an illness. However, Lalala told him that she was old enough to make decisions and, although she appreciated his concern, she decided to accept the mission. Moreover, if something went wrong, Scotty had given her permission to escape. With that said, the protagonist felt more at ease, but at that moment, a group of bandits appeared on the bridge and started shooting arrows at them. Luckily, Tizalia and her friends were nearby, so they began fighting the bandits to allow the protagonist to continue advancing. When they arrived at the base, some bandits were guarding the entrance, but kunai and Scotty took care of them quickly. They reached the harpies and found that they were all fine, or at least most of them were, except for one who was about to lay an egg. Due to the stress, the egg got stuck in her belly, so the protagonist had to start treating her in the basement. To make things more intense, more bandits arrived, but the waifus took care of them. During the fight, we get a brief flashback of Medusa, where we learn that she had been chosen as a mercenary to kill the protagonist's entire family if the deal with humans went wrong. But, distracted by past thoughts, one of the bandits managed to stab her with a poisoned knife, causing her to lose consciousness. Luckily, nothing serious happened, and she woke up next to the protagonist after everything was over. There, she told him that the harpy's egg was no longer a problem, and that the waifus had taken care of the bandits. However, the waifu wasn't very happy because she had to tell him the truth about the flashback. But the protagonist already knew about it. He just chose not to say anything. Thanks to this confession, the waifu fell more in love with the protagonist and tried to make advances on him. But since the poison was still affecting her, they decided to leave that matter for later. In the next scene, the protagonists went to the harpies' village to provide medical attention. The blonde, who was also in love with the protagonist, offered to take them there with her 2 servants. Just as they were on their way, a landslide occurred. Super random. So the waifus pushed the carriage where the blonde was to save her, and luckily, no one was hurt, except for Kai, who unfortunately suffered a sprain. Well, the good part of all this was that the harpies helped them and allowed them to stay so the waifu could rest. As a thank you for their hospitality, the protagonist decided to set up a clinic in their village and started providing medical care to everyone who needed it. After finishing his workday, he decided to take a walk around the village to relax for a bit. But in the middle of that, he meets Lorna, who was very confused about what happened to her friend. So, the blonde started worrying and asked the protagonist to examine her. However, the protagonist already knew what was wrong before doing so because, in the short time they spoke, he realized she was emotionally affected. So, the blonde proposes that he help her regain confidence, as it seems centaur waifus like that sort of thing. The next day, the protagonist takes her to his clinic for a somewhat strange therapy session. So much so that when the waifus found them together, they thought they were doing something inappropriate. But the protagonist was actually doing what the blonde had asked him to do, and was also realigning her bones to correct her posture. After the discipline session, the waifu felt better, and at the same time, we see that Kai was also making progress in his injury. To thank the protagonist for everything he had done for them, they decided to give him a good dose of affection. But since the protagonist was a true gentleman, he left before things got too heated. Our buddy Glenn, after surviving another awkward moment with Kai, joins the waifu group led by Tizalia, the centaur, and gains some self-esteem. Their mission is to visit Eli, a harpy who was emotionally shaken after being kidnapped by bandits. Eli doesn't want anything to do with doctors or treatments. She just wants to talk to Tazalia like a true fan would. But things take a dark turn when we find out that the poor girl can't fly and has lost all her confidence. For a harpy, that's like taking the internet away from a teenager. Glenn, as usual, enters Dr. Mode, examining her with his unique ability to mix professionalism with situations that would make even a mannequin blush. After a lot of show, he concludes that Eli isn't sick. She's just shedding feathers, but she doesn't believe him at all. She runs off crying while everyone wonders why this always happens with Glenn's patients. Tazalia, who never says no to drama, chases after her and manages to calm her down. Amidst her tears, Eli drops the bombshell. She wants to be a gladiator, fight in the arena, and become the champion. Tazalia, in response, "You want to fight? Then fight. You'll have a match, a friendly combat, and well, the result is that Yia tries but ends up defeated, although with dignity. However, Tazalia takes the opportunity to steal a feather as if she were playing detective. When Glenn examines the feather, the light of discovery turns on, and he realizes that it's not just any feather, it's transforming, and not just any transformation. No, we're talking about phoenix feathers. Turns out the girl has legendary bird blood, and she didn't even know it. The thing is, a few days later, Eli shows up euphoric with her new wings, ready to show them off. Well, not only can she fly again, but when she loses another feather in front of Glenn, he notices that it's hot. So, more than just a regular harpy, she's evolving into her legendary Pokemon version. In a scene change, we see Glenn and Sapphonite giving seminars in the village to teach creatures how to take care of their wings and claws. But of course, in this story, doctors don't just heal, they also give TED Talks. But when they're about to leave, a group of harpies arrives, all soaked in a white, viscous liquid. What is that? Spider silk. Glenn, with his all-terrain medical radar, deduces it instantly. And who's weaving all this? Well, a half-spider mana, who turns out to be the monster fashion designer and, surprise, Candite's best friend. There, the little spider is in the forest with a very clear mission: to hunt Eli, our star harpy, to get a closer look at her rainbow-colored wings. Using that excuse, she sets traps all over the forest because, what better way to meet people than by trapping them in sticky webs? Glenn and company convince her that there are more harpies in the village than in her monster shop, and excited, the spider temporarily moves there. Once in the temple, her obsession with Eli's feathers reaches uncomfortable levels, saying things like, "Let me touch the tip of the feathers." Of course, Eli is not fascinated by this invasion of her personal space. The chaos doesn't stop there. The next day, while Sapphonite enjoys some hot springs because, for health reasons, Aranea realizes that Glenn is alone. And if there's one thing we've learned from this anime, it's that no girl misses that opportunity. Aranea drags him into the forest and plays her role as a monster waifu, trying to seduce him with the noble mission of getting closer to Sapphonite. Well, luckily or not, Tazalia comes to the rescue, and a romantic debate breaks out. There, the centaur makes it clear that her love for Glenn is real, while Aranea is just playing the mystery. Just when you think calm has returned, Sapphonite enters boss mode, rescues the doc, and makes it clear that there's no time for romantic drama because he's a serious doctor. Later, after a few drinks, Sapphonite confesses she loves Glenn, though she doesn't expect him to feel the same. The moment is abruptly cut off when an old man appears, terrified, telling them that a giant god, a living legend, is about to destroy the village. Upon hearing that a giant was coming to the village, the people got scared and were already ready to accept their VIP pass to the afterlife. But Tazalia, because it's Tazalia, says, "No way, I'm not giving up," and organizes the evacuation like a true leader. She sends Eli, the speedy harpy, to help Lindworm, the city where the protagonist is from. While the others grab their stuff and leave, nothing is ever simple in this anime. Just when everyone was escaping, Glenn and Sapphonite realize that Tazalia isn't there. Why? Because she decided to face the giant god alone. Well, her master plan: defeat it and, in the process, to get Glenn to marry her. But before he does that madness, Glenn and Siphon arrive just in time. Although it's only to complicate things further, because now the trio decides to search for the giant to face him together. And well, when they finally find him, the first thing the god does is sneeze so forcefully that it sends Glenn flying like a rocket. Well, great first contact. The giant god, who turns out to be named Dion, wasn't there to destroy anything. He was just looking for the doctor because he had been suffering from an eternal cold for years. A sick giant looking for a consultation. So the next day, Glenn, proving he can handle anything, examines the goddess and discovers that her terrible curse is basically a cold that's been going on for 10 years. Well, after a near medical accident with a misstep on Dion's chest, Glenn, being classic Glenn, decides to prescribe medicine and asks Era to make her some clothes. The result, a giant goddess in a Santa Claus suit, because fashion never rests. With the situation under control, Glenn and company return home to reopen the clinic. That night, Glenn invites Tazalia to dinner, who obviously interprets it as a date. But before he can confess his feelings, Sifin appears to declare hers. And so, the verbal duel of the century begins, with both girls fighting for the title of best wife for Glenn. The next day, everything seems calm during the commemoration ceremony in Marrow, but since this is Monster Doctor, the calm doesn't last long. Glenn notices something strange about Scotty's tale, and before he can say anything, Scotty faints in front of everyone. Of course, something always has to happen, right? After Scotty collapses during the ceremony, Glenn and Sifin don't waste any time and take her to the central hospital in Lindworm. But since they're not her regular doctors, they're more lost than a harpy in a tunnel. To get answers, they seek out the doctor in charge, who turns out to be Cooley, a doctor with tentacles and, well, zero respect for the protagonist's personal space. Yes, we know how this goes. Sifin gives her a look of, stay away from my man, while trying to keep her composure. Anyway, putting jealousy aside, Cooley explains that Scotty, despite her dragon resistance, has a serious condition, possibly some form of cancer. But here's the plot twist. Scotty doesn't want to be cured. She's determined to let the disease spread, because she believes it's her punishment for the sins of her dragon ancestors who fled the great battle in the past. Yes, everything is very philosophical, but Glenn isn't going to let anyone die under his care because, well, the protagonist is the protagonist. Later, we see Kanai, Scotty's loyal bodyguard, seeking out Glenn for help, and he accepts without hesitation. When he enters Scotty's room, he finds the calm voice and childlike appearance of the dragoness, who finally agrees to be examined. Glenn then discovers that the tumor is heart-shaped because doing nothing simple is affecting her blood flow. But don't worry, the doctor quickly decides that surgery can solve the problem, and well, this is where the odyssey begins. Glenn asks Cooley for permission to operate, and although she agrees, she puts two conditions. First, convince Scotty, and second, find another surgeon. As if that weren't enough, the damaged veins require extremely precise work. So Glenn turns to Aranya, our high-fashion designer spider, and well, at first, she plays hard to get, but Sephantite suggests that both of them could wear matching nurse uniforms because clearly saving a life isn't enough motivation, but a coordinated outfit is. And well, eventually the preparations for Scotty's surgery begin. The team is ready, the instruments are sharp, and the wives are in strategic positions. But there's a small detail. Scotty still hasn't given her consent. Yes, all this show seems useless because the dragon insists she doesn't want to live. Kunai, the bodyguard, tries to convince her, but Scotty remains in her philosophical mode, thinking, this is the karma of my ancestors. Meanwhile, Glenn heads to a Cyclops workshop to order surgical instruments. Here we meet Meme, a clumsy Cyclops who, as per anime tradition, is in love with the protagonist because, of course, if you breathe and have minimal interaction with Glenn, you fall in love with him. On the way, poor Meme trips, and thanks to a treacherous nail, her clothes tear at the most convenient place for fan service. As always, the protagonist acts as if he doesn't understand why these things happen to him. Well, putting that unforgettable moment aside, Glenn arrives at the workshop and explains the situation to Meme's boss, detailing the list of tools needed for the operation of the year. The Cyclops accepts the contract but warns that making such fine needles will be difficult because he doesn't have the necessary materials. Glenn, with his usual diplomacy, assures him that the hospital will take care of everything. The boss, who seems completely uninterested in the drama, passes the task to Meme, who panics because she feels she won't measure up. But what does Glenn do? Exactly, he motivates her with those magical words, I believe in you. Meanwhile, Aranya is in the clinic practicing her sewing stitches with Kanai because here, she not only sews dresses but also saves lives. Well, in the meantime, Meme gets to work as if her life depends on it, but the excessive effort takes its toll and she ends up fainting in the workshop. But don't worry, it's nothing serious. When they bring her to the clinic, it turns out the exhaustion came because Meme was so inspired that she discovered a new method for making finer and stronger needles. The demonstration of her needles is a success, and everyone in the clinic praises her. So, with Meme as the MVP of this stage, the surgical team is one step closer to saving Scotty. And now, the surgery can begin. Things were finally moving forward, but the protagonist knew that although it was a titanic task, convincing Scotty to undergo the surgery was essential. Yes, that surgery that could save her life, but Scotty didn't think it was so important. You know why? Because she has that mindset of, the karma of my ancestors is chasing me. So, Glenn heads to the central council room in his usual style to try to get the dragon to agree to the operation. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the city, Sephantite, Aranya, and Tazalia decide they have no problems in the world and organize a girls' night. And when I say night, I mean the whole night, because they end up drinking so much that they don't even look at the clock, and before they know it, it's already early morning. Come on, who hasn't had one of those nights, right? Well, they return to the clinic, and like in every good story, Sephantite finds Aranya in the middle of a criminal act, stealing a dragon scale that belonged to Glenn. And of course, Aranya tries to run away with her loot. However, Tazalia and Sephantite stop her in the purest style of, "Where do you think you're going?" But since they're friends and this is anime, they don't expose her. However, they do have a sincere conversation about what's really going on in Araya's heart. And it turns out, surprise, the spider girl has also fallen for the protagonist. Of course, nothing justifies her stealing a dragon scale, but the girls take a break and tell Araya that it's completely normal to be in love. Everyone feels that way, so don't worry, they say. They share some warm hugs and comforting words, and the bed drama is left behind. On the other hand, Glenn continues his mission to show Scotty that surgery is not the end of the world. Well, at the council meeting where everyone is waiting for the dragon to decide whether to undergo the operation or not, Glenn explains that although the sins of her ancestors are her burden, she doesn't have to carry them forever. It's time to live and be happy, Scotty. After a couple of inspiring speeches and a deep look from Glenn, the dragon finally accepts her fate and decides to undergo the surgery. And so, the big day arrives. Glenn, Dr. Sephantite, and Aranya prepare to operate on Scotty, while all of Lindworm anxiously waits. Well, the future of the dragon is in their hands. Will it be a resounding success, or will there be more drama along the way? Only time will tell. After that, we see that the night was long, but the surgery was intense. The doctors, including our dear Glenn and his expert colleagues, Sephantite and Aranya, got serious and worked with more concentration than ever. And of course, they succeeded. The surgery was a success, and the news spread quickly throughout Lindworm. Scotty, the legendary dragon, was alive and better than ever. A few hours of celebration shook the city, with people jumping and cheering as if they had won the World Cup. And it's no wonder. Everything was resolved, and the leader of Lindworm could return to her normal life. Although, well, with a small change in focus. After a few days of rest, let's not forget, she was almost killed by a giant tumor. Scotty got up, put on her best smile, and went to meet her people. The crowd was euphoric, and she, with an expression as proud as if she were a supermodel at her Victoria's Secret show, told them, "I'm out of danger and better than ever," as if the plagues of the past, family tragedies, and terminal illnesses were just a bad dream. But of course, for Scotty, not everything was that simple. After all, what really mattered to her was giving a huge thank you to Glenn, and as expected, another heart fell for him. The charms of the ball, yes, friends, Glenn's list of waifus keeps growing, and now the dragon is also part of the club. This young man is doing well, and well, as with all of Glenn's life, things don't stay calm for long. That very same night, a party was held in the city to celebrate Scotty's recovery, and as expected, all the girls close to our dear hero decided to show their appreciation in very, very physical ways. Among them was Fantite, who, as usual, wasn't at all happy to see how all the others were throwing themselves at the protagonist. But we already know how this works, right? Glenn is like a kind of magnet for girls, and although Fantite wants him only for herself, the poor guy can't avoid it. Well, how can you resist a guy with super cool skin and shiny black hair? Not easy, buddy. But someone has to be the Don Juan of the story.